Hello. I'm really glad you're here tonight. This hour is different from the rest of the day. It doesn't ask you to decide anything. It doesn't ask you to perform or explain or keep up. It simply invites you to lie still and let your thoughts move at their own pace, like water finding its natural course through ancient rice terraces. As the years pass, nighttime becomes a kind of companion, a place where the mind is free to wander without interruption, where memories return, not urgently but patiently, like seeds that have waited seasons to sprout, where understanding settles in quietly, the way silt settles in flooded fields, enriching everything it touches. Later in life, the mind doesn't race the way it once did. It reflects, it revisits, it connects patterns that once seemed separate, the way the farmers of ancient Chenla understood how water and earth and time work together to create abundance. And it does this most honestly when the lights are off and the world has gone silent. Tonight, we're going to explore something that connects us to thousands of years of human wisdom. The inland farming practices of Chenla, the ancient kingdom that understood how to work with water, with soil, with seasons, with patience. Their knowledge wasn't just about growing rice. It was about understanding life itself, about cycles and rhythms, about planting and tending and harvesting and resting, about trusting the process, even when you can't see the results yet. This space is for those thoughts, the ones that don't surface during the day, the ones that arrive only when you're alone with yourself, resting, remembering, gently making sense of a long, lived-in life that has followed its own seasons, its own cycles of growth and harvest and necessary fallow periods. So take a slow breath, let your body soften into the bed, and allow this night to meet you where you are. And now, before we begin, if this kind of honest, gentle reflection speaks to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And down in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. There's something comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, but united in these late hours when the world finally grows still, like fields settling into darkness after a long day under the sun. So settle in. Adjust your pillows, find a comfortable position, and know that for the next hour, you're not alone. In whatever wisdom you're carrying, whatever understanding you've earned, whatever truths rise to the surface when the lights go out. Let's begin. You're lying in bed right now, and your body is beginning to relax. As it does, I want you to imagine something with me. Imagine you're standing at the edge of an ancient rice field in Chenla. The morning mist is rising from the water. The sun is just beginning to warm the earth. In your hands, you hold rice seedlings, their roots still wet from the nursery bed. You're about to plant them. This simple act, this placing of seedlings into flooded soil, this is what we're exploring tonight. Because your life has been like this field. You've planted things, you've tended them, you've watched them grow. You've harvested what came, you've let fields lie fallow. You've started new cycles. You've learned when to work and when to wait. You've understood, eventually, that growth happens in its own time. The farmers of Chenla knew this. They built their entire civilization on this understanding. They didn't fight against the rhythms of nature. They worked with them. They studied the monsoons. They understood how water needed to move. They recognized that rice requires flooding at certain stages and draining at others. They knew that soil needs rest. That abundance comes from respecting natural cycles, not forcing artificial ones. Your life has taught you the same lessons. Maybe not with rice fields, but with relationships, with children, with work, with your own body and mind. You've learned that some things can't be rushed, that growth requires patience, that harvest comes only after long periods of tending, that rest is not laziness but necessary preparation for the next cycle. Let's begin at the beginning. Let's go back to when you were first planted in this world, when you were the seedling. You were small once, a child in your family's field. You didn't plant yourself there. Someone else chose the conditions of your growth, the soil you'd grow in, the amount of water you'd receive, the care or neglect that would shape your early development. You remember those early years, the feeling of being small and new, of depending entirely on others for everything you needed: water, nutrients, protection from harsh conditions, guidance about how to grow. Some of you received abundant care. Your soil was rich, your water consistent. The people tending you were attentive. They removed weeds that might choke your growth. They protected you from storms that might uproot you before you'd established strong roots. They provided the conditions you needed to develop properly. You grew strong because of this tending. Your roots went deep. Your shoots reached confidently toward the sun. You learned that the world was essentially safe, that your needs would be met, that growth was natural and supported. This early abundance shaped everything that came after. Others among you received less consistent care. Your soil was poor or depleted. Your water came irregularly or not at all. The people responsible for your tending were distracted or absent or harmful themselves. You had to grow despite the conditions rather than because of them. You learned to survive, to send roots deeper, searching for nutrients that weren't readily available, to develop resilience because you had no choice, to become self-reliant because depending on others meant disappointment or worse. This scarcity shaped everything that came after too. Most of you experienced something between these extremes, some good conditions and some difficult ones, some attentive care and some neglect, enough to survive and grow, but not always enough to thrive easily. You learned that life was complicated, that the same hands that fed you might also harm you, that abundance and scarcity could exist in the same field. You didn't choose any of this. You were simply planted where you were planted, given the conditions you were given, and you did what all living things do. You grew as best you could with what you had. The farmers of Chenla understood this principle. They knew that seedlings planted in optimal conditions had advantages: better soil, better water flow, better sun exposure. But they also knew that even seedlings in difficult conditions could survive and eventually produce a harvest if they were hardy enough. Nature is resilient. Life persists. You persisted. You survived your childhood. You grew roots and shoots. You developed the particular shape that your specific conditions created. Some of you grew straight and tall. because you had room and support. Others grew crooked because you had to reach around obstacles. Others grew dense and compact because you learned early to protect yourself. All of these growth patterns were adaptive. All of them made sense given your circumstances. There's no shame in the shape your early conditions created. You did what you needed to do to survive. As you grew from child into adolescent, you began to develop differently. Like rice reaching a certain stage of maturity, you started to change form, to develop characteristics that weren't present in the seedling stage, to become something more complex than you'd been. This is when you began to develop your own seeds, your own potential to create new life, new projects, new versions of yourself. Your body changed in ways that confused and excited and sometimes frightened you. You were becoming capable of things you hadn't been capable of before. The Chenla farmers understood this stage too. They knew that rice plants go through a critical transformation. The vegetative stage gives way to the reproductive stage. The plant stops focusing solely on its own growth and begins directing energy toward creating seeds. This transition requires different conditions, different amounts of water, different care. You needed different things during adolescence too. More space, more privacy, more room to figure out who you were becoming. But often, the people tending you didn't adjust their care to match your changing needs. They kept treating you like a seedling when you were becoming something else entirely. You remember the confusion of this time, the feeling of outgrowing your assigned space, of needing things you couldn't name, of experiencing desires and questions and fears that felt too big for your body. You began to notice other fields, other young plants at the same stage you were. You compared yourself to them constantly. Were you growing at the right rate? Were you developing the right characteristics? Were you normal? Were you acceptable? Were you enough? The comparison was exhausting. Some seemed to be thriving in ways you weren't. They seemed more confident, more developed, more certain of their place in the world. You looked at them and felt inadequate, like you were failing at the simple task of growing up properly. What you couldn't see then was that everyone was struggling with the same doubts privately, that the ones who seemed most confident were often the most uncertain inside, that you were all doing your best to figure out an impossibly complex process with very little guidance. You made mistakes during this time. You reached in directions that weren't good for you. You entangled yourself with other plants that stunted your growth or hurt you. You wasted energy on things that didn't matter. You ignored things that did matter. You were confused and trying to learn and making it up as you went. The Chenla farmers knew that young plants make inefficient use of resources. They send roots in unnecessary directions. They produce leaves that will later be shed. They waste energy on growth that doesn't contribute to the final harvest. This is normal. This is how plants learn which strategies work. Through trial and error, through exploration and adjustment. Your adolescence was your trial and error period, your exploration stage. And like all young plants, you couldn't have skipped this phase. You had to live through it, had to make those mistakes, had to learn those lessons the hard way, had to develop the root system and structural strength that would allow you to bear the weight of adulthood later. You survived this stage too. You made it through despite everything, despite the confusion and the mistakes and the pain and the uncertainty. You kept growing. You kept developing. You kept becoming. Then came the next transition. You reached maturity. You left the field you'd been planted in. You were transplanted into new soil. Your own life, your own space, your own responsibility. This was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Suddenly, no one was tending you but yourself. No one was monitoring your water supply or removing your weeds or protecting you from storms. You were on your own in ways you'd never been before. You remember your first independent space, your first apartment, your first job, your first attempt at creating your own field and managing your own growth. Everything felt provisional, temporary, like you were playing pretend at being an adult while waiting for the real adults to arrive and tell you what to do. But they didn't arrive, because you were the adult now. You were responsible for your own cultivation, for providing yourself with the water and nutrients and care you needed, for removing your own weeds, for weathering your own storms. Some days you succeeded at this. You watered yourself adequately. You ate decent food. You slept enough. You maintained your space. You showed up to work. You paid your bills. You handled your responsibilities. You felt capable and competent and like maybe you were going to be okay. Other days you failed completely. You forgot to water yourself. You ate terribly. You stayed up too late. You let your space become chaotic. You barely made it to work. You paid bills late. You dropped responsibilities. You felt incompetent and overwhelmed and certain you were failing at basic adulting. The Chenla farmers understood this variability too. They knew that some seasons brought abundant rain and others brought drought. The fields sometimes flourished and sometimes struggled. That a farmer's job was to do the best they could with the conditions they faced, not to achieve perfection constantly. You were learning to be your own farmer, to tend your own field, to make decisions about when to push and when to rest, to recognize when you needed more water, more nutrients, more sun, more shelter, to understand your own rhythms and requirements. This took time. Years, actually. You didn't become skilled at self-cultivation quickly. You had to learn through experience, through seasons of growth and seasons of struggle, through abundance and scarcity, through success and failure. During this time, you began to experiment with different crops, different versions of yourself, different ways of living. You tried on careers and relationships and identities, like the farmers of Chenla tried different rice varieties, testing which ones thrived in which conditions. Some experiments succeeded. You found work that suited you, or at least sustained you. You developed friendships that nourished you. You created routines that supported your well-being. You discovered interests that gave you pleasure. You built a life that felt manageable, even if it wasn't perfect. Other experiments failed. You pursued paths that led nowhere. You invested in relationships that depleted you. You developed habits that harmed you. You discovered that some versions of yourself couldn't survive in the real world, no matter how appealing they seemed in theory. Each failure taught you something about your limits, about your needs, about what conditions you require to thrive, about what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not, about who you actually are versus who you thought you were or who others wanted you to be. The Chenla farmers learned through failure too. They flooded fields too early or too late and lost crops. They planted in soil that wasn't ready. They harvested prematurely or waited too long. Each mistake taught them something about timing, about observation, about working with natural rhythms rather than imposing artificial ones. You were learning the same lessons in your own field. You were developing farmer's wisdom, the kind of knowledge that comes only from direct experience, from paying attention to what works and what doesn't, from adjusting your approach based on actual results rather than theoretical ideals. Then something shifted. You met someone, or you'd known them for a while, and suddenly saw them differently. Suddenly, you wanted to merge your field with theirs, to create something together, to stop farming alone. This was both beautiful and complicated. Two plants that have grown independently in their own patterns, with their own root systems, suddenly trying to share the same soil, trying to coordinate their need for water and sun, trying to grow together rather than separately. You remember the early stages of this merging, the excitement, the hope, the feeling that you'd finally found someone who understood you, who wanted to grow alongside you, who'd help tend your field and allow you to tend theirs. You learned new skills during this time. Compromise, communication, the art of supporting another's growth while maintaining your own, the balance between staying rooted in yourself and leaning toward another, the delicate negotiation of shared space. Some of you succeeded at creating this shared field. You learned to grow together, to coordinate your rhythms, to provide water when the other was dry, to offer shade when the other was overwhelmed by too much sun, to create a microclimate that supported both of you better than either could have managed alone. Your roots intertwined, your growth patterns influenced each other. You became not just two separate plants, but an ecosystem, something larger and more complex than either of you was individually, something resilient because it had redundancy. When one of you struggled, the other could carry more weight temporarily. When both of you thrived, the abundance was shared. The Chenla farmers understood companion planting. They knew that certain plants grown together create conditions that benefit both. That rice grown with certain legumes enriches the soil. That diversity creates stability. That interdependence, when balanced properly, increases resilience. Your relationship became this kind of companion planting. When it worked beautifully. You supported each other's growth. You created abundance together. You weathered storms that might have destroyed either of you alone. You built something that felt permanent and good and worth the compromise it required. But companion planting also creates vulnerabilities. When one plant becomes diseased, the other is at risk. When one plant's needs change, the other must adapt. When one plant dies, the other must survive in soil that's been altered by the other's presence and absence. Some of your relationships encountered these difficulties. One of you changed in ways the other couldn't accommodate. One of you developed needs that conflicted with the other's needs. One of you stopped thriving in the shared soil. One of you wanted different conditions, than the relationship could provide. You tried to make it work. You adjusted and compromised and bent yourselves into shapes that might fit better together. You tried different configurations, different arrangements of resources, different ways of sharing space. Sometimes this saved the relationship. Sometimes it just prolonged the inevitable. Sometimes you realized that two plants that once grew well together had reached stages where they needed fundamentally different conditions, where one needed flooding and the other needed drainage, where staying together meant both of you would suffer. The ending of these relationships was agonizing, whether you chose it or it was chosen for you, whether it happened slowly or suddenly, whether it was mutual or contested. The pain was immense. Your roots had intertwined. Pulling them apart damaged both of you, left wounds that took years to heal, left you questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself and others and love and commitment, and whether any of it meant anything, if it could end like this. You had to learn to grow alone again, in soil that had been shaped by another's presence, in a space that felt wrong without them, with a root system that kept reaching for someone who was no longer there. The Chenla farmers knew about crop rotation. They knew that fields couldn't grow the same crop forever, that soil becomes depleted, that sometimes fields need to be left fallow, that this feels like waste and loss, but is actually necessary for future abundance, that the field lying empty is still doing important work even though nothing visible is growing. Your fallow periods felt like this, like nothing was happening, like you were wasting time, like you should be growing something, producing something, becoming something, but actually, you were recovering. Your soil was regenerating. Your root system was healing. You were preparing for whatever would be planted next. During these fallow times, you learned to be alone differently than you'd been alone before. You weren't the young adult just learning independence anymore. You were someone who tried partnership and lost it. Someone who knew both the benefits and costs of shared cultivation. Someone who'd learned that being alone was better than being with the wrong person in wrong conditions. This knowledge was earned through pain, but it was real knowledge, true wisdom that would inform all your future planting decisions. You'd learn to recognize the difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and necessary rest, between giving up and letting go. Some of you never partnered again after these early heartbreaks. You chose to remain a single plant in your field, to direct all your energy toward your own growth, to create abundance through individual cultivation rather than shared farming. This was a legitimate choice, not a failure or a lack, just a different approach to living. The Chenla farmers maintained some fields as single crops too. Sometimes this made sense. Sometimes individual cultivation produced better results than companion planting. Others of you tried again. You took the lessons from your failures and applied them to new relationships. You chose more carefully. You communicated better. You maintained better boundaries. You didn't lose yourself as completely in the merging. Some of these second or third or fourth attempts succeeded where earlier ones hadn't. You found someone who fit better, who wanted similar conditions, who was at a compatible stage of growth. who had learned their own lessons and brought their own wisdom to the shared field. You build something more sustainable this time, more realistic, based on who you actually were rather than who you hoped to become or who the other person wanted you to be, based on real compatibility rather than projection or desperation or timing. These relationships had a different quality than the earlier ones. Less intense, perhaps, but more stable. Less exciting, but more peaceful. Less dramatic, but more nourishing. You'd traded the volatile energy of young love for the steady sustenance of mature partnership. The Chenla farmers understood that mature rice plants require different conditions than young ones, that the goal shifts from rapid growth to sustained production, that stability becomes more valuable than excitement, that the quiet work of maintenance is what creates reliable harvest year after year. Your mature relationships required this same steady maintenance. Daily tending, consistent watering, regular weeding, attention to small problems before they became large ones. The unglamorous work of actually sharing a life with another imperfect person over years and decades. This work was hard, harder than the exciting early stages, harder than the dramatic conflicts and resolutions. The hardest part was the dailiness of it, the showing up even when you didn't feel like it, the continuing to tend when you were tired or frustrated or bored, the choosing again and again to stay and work rather than leave and start over. But this daily tending created something valuable, something that couldn't exist without time and consistency, roots that had truly intertwined, growth patterns that had genuinely merged, a shared ecosystem that had developed its own character and resilience. You built history together, shared memories, inside jokes, coordinated rhythms, the ability to predict each other's needs, the comfort of being known completely and loved anyway, the security of having someone who'd tend your field when you couldn't, who'd water you when you were depleted, who'd survived enough seasons with you to know that difficult periods pass. Then, for some of you, children arrived. Suddenly, you weren't just tending your own field or your shared field. You were responsible for new seedlings, for creating optimal conditions for other plants to grow, for being the farmer you'd once needed. This changed everything. Your entire field was reorganized around these new seedlings. Their needs took priority. Their growth consumed most of your resources. Your own development slowed or stopped entirely while you focused on theirs. You remember the exhaustion of those early years, the constant tending, the sleepless nights, the feeling that you'd never have time or energy for yourself again, that you'd disappeared into the role of farmer and ceased to exist as a plant yourself. But you also remember the wonder, the privilege, the profound meaning that came from tending these new lives, from watching them grow, from providing them with conditions you'd wished you'd had or replicating conditions you'd been grateful for, from giving them water and nutrients and protection and love. You were their entire world during those early years. You were the sun and rain and soil and shelter. Everything they needed to survive came from you. This was both beautiful and overwhelming. The weight of being that essential to another living thing. The Chenla farmers understood this weight. They knew that young rice plants are completely vulnerable, that they require constant attention, that the farmer must monitor water levels daily, must watch for pests and diseases, must intervene quickly when problems arise, that the survival of the crop depends entirely on the farmer's attention and care during these critical early stages. You provided this attention, this care. You watched your children constantly. You intervened when they needed you. You protected them from threats. You created the conditions they needed to develop properly. You were the farmer your field required. As your children grew, your farming role evolved. They needed less direct intervention, more guidance than constant care, more teaching than doing for them. You had to learn when to step back, when to let them struggle, when to allow small failures that would teach important lessons. This was harder than the constant tending of the early years. Stepping back required trust in them, in yourself, in the conditions you'd created, in the root system they developed. You had to believe they were strong enough to handle challenges, that your early tending had prepared them adequately. Sometimes you stepped back too soon. They weren't ready. They struggled more than they should have. You watched them hurt and wondered if you'd failed them, if you should have protected them longer, provided more support, been more present. Other times, you stepped back too late. You hovered when you should have released. You provided water they should have learned to find themselves. You solved problems they needed to solve independently. You weakened them with too much care. The balance was impossible to get right consistently. The Chenla farmers dealt with this same uncertainty. When to flood and when to drain. When to intervene and when to trust the natural process. Too much water drowns the crop. Too little starves it. The timing has to be right, and the timing is never obvious. You did your best. You made decisions with incomplete information. You adjusted when you saw you'd misjudged. You apologized when you hurt them. You celebrated when you got it right. You accepted that you were an imperfect farmer, raising imperfect plants in imperfect conditions. Your children grew despite your mistakes. They developed their own root systems, their own growth patterns, their own adaptations to the conditions they faced. They became themselves, which wasn't always who you'd imagined they'd become. Some matched your hopes closely. They thrived in ways that made your heart expand. They developed characteristics you admired. They made choices you understood. They created lives that made sense to you. Watching them was pure joy, pure satisfaction, evidence that your tending had worked. Others diverged from your hopes dramatically. They struggled in ways you couldn't fix. They developed characteristics that worried you. They made choices you didn't understand. They created lives that seemed precarious or wrong to you. Watching them was agony, constant fear, evidence that either your tending had failed or that some plants simply required different conditions than you could provide. Most of your children were somewhere between these extremes. Some parts of them matched your hopes. Other parts surprised or disappointed or confused you. They were complex combinations of your influence and their own nature and random chance. They were themselves, which meant they were both exactly what you helped create and completely independent of your intentions. The Chenla farmers knew that individual rice plants in the same field develop differently. Same soil, same water, same sun, same care. But still, some plants grow tall while others stay compact. Some produce abundant grain while others produce modestly. Some resist disease while others succumb. Individual variation is real and inevitable and doesn't necessarily reflect the farmer's skill. You had to learn this about your children, that who they became wasn't entirely about you, that you'd provided conditions and care, but they'd made their own use of what you offered, that some of their struggles weren't your fault, that some of their successes weren't your credit, that they were separate beings who'd lived their own lives even while growing in your field. Learning to let them leave was perhaps the hardest farming lesson of all. You'd spent years, decades, tending them, making them the center of your field, organizing your entire life around their needs. And then suddenly they were gone, transplanted into their own fields, growing independently, no longer requiring your daily care. The field felt empty, too quiet, too spacious. You still had the instinct to tend them, but no longer had access. You had to trust they'd internalized enough of your teaching, that their roots were strong enough, that they'd learned to tend themselves adequately. Some nights you lay awake worrying, wanting to water them but unable to reach them, knowing they were facing storms and unable to shelter them, seeing problems they couldn't see yet and unable to warn them effectively. The helplessness was excruciating. The Chenla farmers felt this too when they harvested rice. They tended these plants through their entire growth cycle, watched them daily, adjusted conditions constantly, and then they cut them down, separated the grain from the stalks. The plant's independent existence ended. It became seed for future planting or food to sustain other life. This was both loss and fulfillment. The plant had completed its cycle. It had grown and matured and produced. The farmer's work had succeeded, but still there was grief in the cutting, in the ending, in the empty field. Your empty nest carried this same complexity. Pride and grief intertwined, satisfaction and loss. The knowledge that you'd succeeded in raising them to independence, and the ache of no longer being needed in the same way. You had to figure out who you were when you weren't primarily a parent anymore. When your field wasn't organized around young plants requiring constant care. When your resources were yours again, to direct however you chose. This transition was disorienting. You'd been a farmer of others for so long. Could you remember how to be your own crop again? Did you even know what you needed anymore? What you wanted? Who you were when you weren't defined by your tending of others? Some of you struggled with this transition. Your identity had been so wrapped up in parenting that its ending felt like your ending. You felt purposeless, unnecessary, like your most important work was finished, and nothing ahead could match its meaning. Others welcomed this transition. You reclaimed your field eagerly. You started new projects. You pursued interests you'd postponed. You traveled. You learned new skills. You reinvested in your partnership or in friendships or in yourself. You discovered or rediscovered parts of yourself that had been dormant during the intensive parenting years. Most of you experienced both responses: grief and relief, loss and liberation, the ache of no longer being needed, and the joy of having time and energy for yourself again. The Chenla farmers knew that fields go through many seasons, that the same land that produced abundantly in spring might lie quiet in winter, that this wasn't failure. It was the natural rhythm of growth and rest, of giving and receiving, of active seasons and dormant ones. You're entering a different season now. Your field has changed, your body has changed. The conditions you once thrived in no longer work the same way. The farming methods that sustained you for decades require adjustment. You notice this in small ways first. Tasks that were once easy now require more effort. Your body doesn't recover as quickly. Your energy depletes faster. You need more rest between periods of exertion. You're not the young plant you once were. You're not even the mature plant at peak production anymore. You're becoming an elder plant, one that's lived through many seasons, that's survived droughts and floods and storms, that's produced harvests and endured fallow periods, that carries knowledge in its very structure, wisdom encoded in its growth rings. This transition brings losses, real losses that must be acknowledged. Your physical field is declining. The soil of your body is becoming depleted. Your root system isn't absorbing nutrients as efficiently. Your leaves aren't converting sunlight as effectively. The machinery of your physical existence is wearing out. You feel this in your joints, in your energy levels, in your memory, in your sleep patterns, in your digestion, in your stamina. In 1,000 small ways, your body reminds you daily that you're aging. That time is taking its toll, that nothing lasts forever, including you. The Chenla farmers watched their fields age too. They saw how soil became exhausted after years of production, how even the best tended fields eventually needed extended fallow periods, how the land itself grew tired and required rest that went beyond normal seasonal dormancy. They didn't see this as failure. They saw it as the natural consequence of having lived, of having produced, of having given. The exhausted field had earned its rest through years of abundance. Its depletion was evidence of its generosity, not its inadequacy. Your body has earned its rest too. It's carried you through decades. It's produced children or work or art or service. It survived illnesses and injuries and the ordinary wear of living. It's walked thousands of miles, lifted countless weights, healed from innumerable small damages. It's been a good field, a productive field, a field that's given much. Now it's tired. Now it needs different care than it needed before. More rest, gentler treatment, acceptance of limitations that didn't exist before. This isn't weakness. This is the reality of having lived long enough to wear out, of having used your body well enough that it shows the evidence of that use. You're learning to be a different kind of farmer in this season, one who works with declining resources rather than abundant ones, who accepts what the field can no longer produce, who finds satisfaction in smaller harvests, who measures success differently than before. This requires humility. The young farmer you once were believed in endless expansion, in constant growth, in perpetual increase. You thought you could push your field indefinitely, that with enough effort, you could maintain peak production forever. You've learned otherwise. You've learned that growth has limits, that production has costs, that every harvest depletes something, that fields that produce constantly eventually collapse. That rest isn't optional, but necessary for survival. The Chenla farmers built this understanding into their entire agricultural system. They rotated crops. They allowed fields to lie fallow. They flooded fields to replenish nutrients. They understood that abundance came from working with natural limits, rather than trying to transcend them. You're applying this wisdom to your own field now. You're resting more, saying no more, protecting your energy more carefully, accepting that you can't do everything you once could, that your field, in this season, requires gentler tending and smaller expectations. This acceptance doesn't come easily. You fight against it sometimes. You push yourself too hard, trying to prove you're still capable. You resent your limitations. You grieve what you've lost. You compare yourself to your younger self and feel diminished by the comparison. But on other days, you find peace in this season. You appreciate the slower pace, the reduced demands, the permission to rest that age provides, the freedom from constant striving, the ability to simply be rather than constantly do. You notice things now that you missed during busier seasons: the quality of morning light, the sound of rain, the texture of your blankets, the taste of simple food, the comfort of routine, the pleasure of small things that once seemed insignificant. The Chenla farmers in their later years spent more time observing and less time laboring. They'd earned the right to supervise rather than execute, to advise rather than perform, to pass on knowledge rather than demonstrate strength. Their value shifted from physical capability to accumulated wisdom. Your value has shifted too. You're no longer the strongest or fastest or most productive, but you're wise. You understand patterns that younger people miss. You recognize cycles because you've lived through them multiple times. You know what matters and what doesn't because time has revealed the difference. You've become an elder plant in your field, one that younger plants look to for guidance, whether they acknowledge it or not. Your presence teaches lessons about survival, about perseverance, about adapting to changing conditions, about maintaining dignity through difficulty. Some of the people in your field have disappeared, partners who died, friends who passed, parents who aged out of life, siblings who left too soon. The field that was once crowded with familiar plants has become sparse, emptier, lonelier. Each loss changed the conditions of your field. When a long-standing companion plant dies, the soil is different. The water flows differently. The sun reaches places it didn't before. You have to adapt to conditions altered by their absence. Some of these deaths were expected. Long illnesses gave you time to prepare, to say goodbyes, to adjust gradually to the coming loss. You watched them decline. You tended them as they weakened. You were present as they transitioned from living to dying. The Chenla farmers understood this gradual harvest. They watched rice mature slowly. They observed the signs of readiness. They knew when the grain had filled completely and the plant had given everything it could. They harvested with respect for what the plant had produced, an acknowledgement of its complete life cycle. You tried to bring this same respect to your loved ones' deaths, to honor what they'd produced, to acknowledge their complete lives, to be present for their final season without trying to deny or forestall the natural ending that was coming. But witnessing death is never simply peaceful, no matter how prepared you are. You watched people you loved diminish, lose capabilities, experience pain, face fear, struggle with letting go, die in ways that were sometimes gentle and sometimes agonizing and always final. You held hands across that threshold. You spoke words of love and permission and reassurance. You promised to remember them, to carry their stories, to tend the parts of the field they'd cared for, to ensure their lives meant something beyond their physical existence. Their deaths changed you. Each one taught you something about mortality, about fragility, about what matters in the final moments, about how you want to face your own death when it comes. You carry them with you now, not in a mystical sense necessarily, but in the way their influence shaped your field, in the space they occupied that's now empty but still defined by their having been there, in the lessons they taught, in the love they gave, in the ways they changed you that persist even though they're gone. Other deaths were sudden, unexpected. No time to prepare or say goodbye. They were there, and then they weren't. The field rearranged itself violently around their absence. You were left shocked, traumatized, unable to accept the sudden transformation from presence to void. These deaths felt cruel, unfair, wrong, like a storm that destroys crops without warning, without reason, without regard for the farmer's careful tending or the plant's potential. Just random devastation that leaves you standing in a ruined field trying to understand what happened. The Chenla farmers experienced these crop failures too. Sudden floods, unexpected droughts, disease that swept through seemingly healthy fields overnight, destruction that made no sense. That couldn't be predicted or prevented. That simply had to be survived and recovered from. You survived these sudden losses. You recovered. Though recovery doesn't mean forgetting or getting over it. Recovery means learning to live in a field forever altered by what was taken. Learning to grow around the absence. Learning to continue even though continuing feels wrong. You learned that grief doesn't end. It changes. It becomes something you carry rather than something you're drowning in. It becomes part of your field's permanent geography, a place you visit sometimes, a memorial in the landscape of your life, a reminder that you love deeply enough to be devastated by loss. Some of you have lost partners who were companion plants for decades, half your life or more. Your roots were completely intertwined, your growth patterns completely merged. You weren't separate plants anymore. You were an ecosystem, a symbiotic relationship where neither of you could imagine existing without the other. And then they died, and you didn't. And you had to figure out how to be a single plant again in soil that was shaped by both of you, how to grow in a space designed for two, how to function with half your root system gone. The loneliness of this is profound, absolute. You wake up alone. You eat alone. You make decisions alone. You face the night alone. The bed that was shared for decades is now just yours. The covers that were negotiated are now yours to arrange however you want. The space that was intimate is now empty. You miss them in ways you didn't expect. Not just the big things, but the small rhythms of shared life. The sound of their breathing, the particular way they moved through the house, their comments on the news, their presence in adjacent rooms, the feeling of not being alone even when you weren't together. You talk to them sometimes, out loud or in your head. You tell them things, ask their advice, share observations, maintain the conversation even though they can't respond. This might seem foolish, but it's not. It's you maintaining connection the only way you can now. It's you refusing to let death completely sever what you built together. The Chenla farmers maintained shrines to ancestors. They honored the dead not just in memory, but in practice. They consulted them, included them in decisions, acknowledged that the dead still influenced the living, that what they taught and built and created continued to matter even after their physical presence ended. You're doing something similar, keeping them present, honoring what they meant, continuing what they started, living in a way that respects what you built together. This is how the dead continue, through the living who remember them, through the fields they help tend that keep producing, even after they're gone. But you're also learning to be alone in new ways, to make decisions without consultation, to develop preferences that are only yours, to create routines that serve only your needs, to discover or rediscover who you are when you're not part of a pair. This feels disloyal sometimes, like you're betraying them by continuing to grow, by adapting to their absence, by eventually feeling okay sometimes, by laughing again, by enjoying things again, by being alive while they're not. But you're learning that continuing to live isn't betrayal. It's what they would want. It's what you promised probably in those final conversations. To be okay, to keep going, to not let their death end your life too, to honor what you had by living well with what remains. Some of you have faced your own serious illnesses. Your field has been struck by disease or disaster. You've had to fight to survive conditions that could have killed you. You've undergone treatments that felt worse than the illness. You've faced mortality directly and somehow made it through. These experiences changed you fundamentally. They revealed your fragility in ways you couldn't ignore. They taught you that your body could betray you, that health is not guaranteed, that everything can fall apart rapidly, that survival is sometimes just luck. The Chenla farmers dealt with crop diseases too, infestations that threatened entire fields, blights that spread rapidly, problems that required drastic intervention to control. Sometimes the intervention saved the crop, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the cure was almost as destructive as the disease. Your treatments felt like this: chemotherapy or surgery or radiation or whatever protocol was required. Interventions that harmed you in order to heal you, that destroyed parts of your field to save the whole, that left you weakened and changed and grateful to be alive, but aware of what survival cost. You carry scars now, visible or invisible, physical or emotional, evidence of what you survived, reminders of your vulnerability, proof that you're still here despite everything. These scars are part of your field now. They're not shameful, they're historical markers. They tell the story of storms survived, of resilience, of the body's remarkable capacity to heal even from severe damage, of your will to live, being stronger than the forces that tried to end you. You're more cautious now, more aware of symptoms, more vigilant about changes, more compliant with medical recommendations. You've learned that ignoring problems doesn't make them disappear, that early intervention matters, that your body deserves attention and care and respect. But you're also more appreciative, more present, more conscious of how precious ordinary days are, how miraculous it is to feel relatively okay, to move without pain, to breathe easily, to have energy, to be alive at all. Illness taught you that nothing is guaranteed, that tomorrow might not come, that this moment is all you actually have, that waiting for the right time to do things means maybe never doing them, that life is now or possibly never. So you've stopped waiting. You've done some of the things you postponed for decades. You've said some of the words you were saving. You've taken some of the trips you were planning for later. You've lived more fully because you've learned that you might not have unlimited time to do it later. The Chenla farmers understood seasonal timing. They knew that planting too late meant missing the monsoons, that harvesting too late meant losing the crop, that there were windows of opportunity that closed and didn't reopen, that timing mattered, that now was sometimes the only option. You're applying this wisdom to your own life. You're acting on things rather than endlessly planning them. You're saying yes to experiences while you still can. You're prioritizing what actually matters. You're spending your remaining energy on things that align with your values rather than obligations that don't. This feels selfish sometimes, like you should still be sacrificing yourself for others, still putting everyone else's needs first, still playing the roles you've always played. But you're learning that you don't owe endless depletion to anyone, that protecting your own field is not selfishness, but survival, that you deserve to tend yourself, especially now, when your resources are limited. Some people in your life don't understand this shift. They expect you to be who you've always been, available, accommodating, self-sacrificing. They're upset when you set boundaries, when you say no, when you prioritize yourself, when you stop volunteering for every request. Their disappointment is real, but it's not your responsibility. You spent decades being what others needed. You earned the right to be what you need now, to use your remaining energy on your own priorities, to tend your own field according to your own judgment. The Chenla farmers, in their later years, focused on the fields closest to home. They didn't try to manage vast territories anymore. They concentrated their efforts on smaller areas they could tend well. They accepted that contraction was appropriate, that doing less, but doing it well, was success in this season. You're contracting too. Your social circle is smaller, your obligations fewer, your focus narrower. This isn't failure. This is appropriate adjustment to available resources. This is wisdom about what you can sustain. This is the natural narrowing that comes with age and declining energy. You spend more time alone now, not because you're completely isolated, but because you need more solitude. Because social interaction depletes you faster. Because you need recovery time after exertion. Because quiet has become more necessary and more precious. You've made peace with this, mostly. You don't feel the same desperate loneliness you felt when you were younger. You've learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely. That solitude can be peaceful rather than painful. That your own company is sufficient, even good. You think about legacy now in ways you didn't before. About what will remain after you're gone. About whether your life meant something. About whether you made any lasting contribution. About what you're leaving behind. The Chenla farmers thought about this too. They wanted to leave their fields better than they found them. To pass on knowledge to the next generation. To ensure that their work continued after they were gone. To be remembered not just as individuals but as links in a long chain of cultivation. Your legacy is complicated. It's your children if you had them. The ways you influenced their growth, the wisdom you passed on, the love you gave, the conditions you created for them. They carry you forward, whether they acknowledge it or not. Your influence is encoded in them, in their choices, in their values, in their parenting if they become parents, in the ripples that extend beyond what you can see. But legacy is also the work you did, the service you provided, the problems you solved, the things you created, the people you helped, the ways you made your corner of the world slightly better. These contributions matter even if they don't carry your name, even if no one remembers who did them. The good remains even when the doer is forgotten. Legacy is also the land itself, the field you tended, whether you left it depleted or enriched, whether you took more than you gave or gave more than you took, whether the soil is better or worse for your having been there. This is the measure the Chenla farmers used. Did you tend well? Did you work with the land rather than against it? Did you leave it capable of sustaining future growth? You don't know how you'll be judged by this measure. You made mistakes. You were selfish sometimes. You took more than you should have. You didn't always tend well. You hurt people. You wasted resources. You failed at things you should have succeeded at. But you also tried. You showed up. You did your best with what you knew. You learned from failures. You adjusted when you could. You loved imperfectly but genuinely. You gave even when it was hard. You persisted even when you wanted to quit. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the measure isn't perfection, but effort. Not flawless execution, but genuine attempt. Not leaving a perfect field, but leaving a field that shows evidence of having been tended with care and intention, even if the results were mixed. The Chenla farmers knew that even the best farmers had failed crops, that even the most skilled had seasons of poor harvest, that competence didn't guarantee success, that you could do everything right and still face devastation, that the measure of a farmer was not whether they ever failed, but whether they continued farming after failure. You continued. That's the evidence of your character. You faced failures and kept going. You experienced losses and survived them. You made mistakes and learned from them. You fell and got up. You were depleted and found ways to restore yourself. You wanted to quit and didn't. This persistence is your achievement, not the specific outcomes, not the perfect moments, not the times everything worked, but the continuation, the refusal to abandon your field even when it would have been easier, the daily choice to keep tending even when you couldn't see the point. You're thinking about death more directly now, not morbidly, but practically. It's closer than it used to be, more real, more inevitable. You can feel it approaching even though you don't know when it will arrive. Some days, this frightens you. The absolute finality, the not knowing what comes after, the loss of everything familiar, the separation from everyone you love, the ending of your consciousness, your field going dark permanently. Other days you feel curious about it, wondering what it's like, whether there's anything after, whether you'll see people who've gone before, whether death is painful or peaceful or just nothing, whether the transition is difficult or easy. Still other days you feel almost ready for it, tired enough that rest sounds appealing, worn enough that stopping sounds acceptable. You've lived a long time. You've experienced much. You're aware that nothing lasts forever, and you've had your turn. Your field has produced what it was going to produce. Your season is coming to its natural conclusion. The Chenla farmers understood that harvest meant ending, that cutting the rice killed the plant, that separating grain from stalk destroyed the original organism, that harvest was simultaneously fulfillment and death. The plant's purpose was completed through its ending. Its life made sense because it produced something that would sustain other life and seed future planting. Your death will be like this, an ending that's also a completion, a harvest of a life lived, the grain separated from the stalk, what you produced continuing even as your individual existence ends, your children carrying forward, your influence persisting, your contributions remaining, the seeds you planted continuing to grow even after the original plant is gone. This is the only immortality that's certain. Not your continued existence, but your continued influence. Not your permanent survival, but your temporary contribution to the ongoing flow of life. You were part of the great cultivation. You received the field from those before you. You tended it as best you could. You'll pass it on to those after you. The field continues even though individual farmers don't. You're preparing for this transition now, whether you're conscious of it or not. You're simplifying, letting go, saying what needs to be said, resolving what can be resolved, making peace with what can't be resolved, releasing grudges, forgiving yourself and others, completing your business so you can leave without too much unfinished. This is the final farming work, preparing the field for your departure, making sure your absence won't leave disaster behind, tying up loose ends, providing what guidance you can for those who'll continue without you, acknowledging that your time here is temporary and your departure inevitable. Some days you do this work consciously. You write things down. You have difficult conversations. You clarify your wishes. You organize your affairs. You make your death as easy as possible for those who'll have to deal with it. Other days, you do this work unconsciously. You notice yourself caring less about things that used to matter. You feel yourself detaching slightly from outcomes. You experience a loosening of the grip you once had on control and certainty and permanence. You're practicing letting go in small ways that prepare you for the final, complete letting go. The Chenla farmers spent their final years teaching, passing on what they'd learned, making sure their knowledge didn't die with them. They told stories about successful seasons and failed ones, about what worked and what didn't, about patterns they'd observed over decades, about wisdom earned through experience. You're doing this too in your own way, sharing what you've learned with whoever will listen. Your children, your grandchildren, younger colleagues, friends, even strangers sometimes. You're planting seeds of wisdom that might grow after you're gone. Some of this wisdom is practical. How to manage money, how to maintain a house, how to cook certain dishes, how to fix common problems. Skills you want to pass on before they're lost. Some is relational. How to love people well, how to maintain long-term partnerships, how to raise children, how to navigate conflicts, how to forgive, how to stay connected across differences. Lessons you learn through years of relationship. Some is existential. How to find meaning, how to endure suffering, how to survive loss, how to face mortality, how to live with uncertainty, how to accept what can't be changed. Wisdom earned through decades of living. You don't know if anyone is really listening, if your wisdom will be received or rejected, if it will help or be ignored. But you offer it anyway, because passing it on is what elders do, because knowledge that dies with you is wasted, because maybe something you say will help someone somewhere, somehow. The nights are different now than they were in earlier seasons. You wake more often, sleep more lightly, dream more vividly, or don't dream at all. Your body has its own rhythms now that don't match conventional patterns. You lie awake sometimes in the deep night, the house quiet, the world dark, your mind active even though your body is exhausted. You think about your life, about the field you've tended, about the seasons you've lived through, about everything that brought you to this moment. These night hours are sacred in their way, times when you're most honest with yourself, when you face truths you avoid during daylight, when you feel the full weight of your years, when you acknowledge your mortality directly, when you're most aware of being alive and of that life being temporary. The Chenla farmers worked early mornings and late evenings when the sun was less harsh. The middle of the day was for rest. The early and late hours were for labor. They understood that different times required different activities, that the rhythm of work and rest had to match natural cycles. Your rhythm now is different from the conventional one. You might be most alert late at night, most contemplative in early morning, most energetic in afternoon. You've stopped trying to force yourself into patterns that don't work. You've accepted your own natural rhythm even if it doesn't match others' schedules. This is another form of wisdom, knowing yourself well enough to honor your actual needs rather than performing needs you're supposed to have. Tending your field according to its actual requirements rather than theoretical ones. You're lying in bed now, and you can feel the weight of these years, the accumulation of seasons the lifetime of cultivation, the decades of tending, all of it present in this moment. All of it part of who you are right now. You're tired, deeply tired, not just physically, tired in your bones, in your soul. The kind of tired that comes from having lived a long time, from having carried heavy things, from having endured difficult seasons, from having loved and lost and continued anyway. This tiredness is earned. It's evidence of having lived fully enough to be exhausted, of having given enough to be depleted, of having cared enough to be worn out. It's honorable tiredness, the kind that comes from good work done over decades. You're ready to rest now, really rest, not the shallow rest of a nap or a vacation, but deep rest, the kind that restores fundamentally, the kind that comes from finally being able to stop striving, stop producing, stop tending, stop working. Just stop and be still and let the field lie fallow. The Chenla farmers understood fallow periods. They knew fields needed time with no demands, no planting, no cultivation, no harvest, just rest. Deep, complete rest that allowed full restoration. They didn't see this as waste, but as necessity, as the foundation of all future productivity. You're entering your fallow period, your time of deep rest, your season of not producing. This is appropriate. This is earned. This is the natural rhythm of a life fully lived. You've given what you had to give. You've tended what was yours to tend. You've produced what you were capable of producing. Now it's time to rest, to let go of responsibility, to release the burden of constant tending, to trust that the field will continue without you, that what you planted will keep growing, that your work was enough, even if it wasn't perfect, that you can stop now, that you've done enough, that you are enough. Breathe slowly now. Feel your body sinking into the mattress. Feel the covers warm around you. Feel the softness of your pillow. Feel the safety of your bed. This is your field, your space, your place of rest. All those seasons you lived through, all those cycles of planting and tending and harvesting, all those transformations, all those lessons, all that growth, it all led here, to this moment, to this bed, to this breath, to this peaceful settling into rest. You don't need to do anything more tonight. You don't need to solve anything or figure anything out or tend anything. Tonight is just for rest, for allowing, for surrendering to the natural rhythm of sleep, for trusting your body to restore itself while you're unconscious. The Chenla farmers ended each day knowing they'd done what they could. They couldn't control the weather. They couldn't force the rice to grow faster. They couldn't prevent all disasters. They could only tend faithfully and trust the process and accept whatever came. You've done what you could, with your life, with your relationships, with your work, with yourself. You've tended as well as you knew how. You've worked with the conditions you were given. You've adjusted when you could. You've persisted through difficulties. You've created what you were capable of creating. That's enough. You're enough. Your life is enough. Your field, however imperfect, is enough. The harvest, however modest, is enough. You don't need to produce more, or be more, or accomplish more to justify your existence. You've lived. That's sufficient. That's complete. Let yourself rest now in this knowing. Let yourself release the striving. Let yourself accept that your value isn't in your productivity, but in your simple existence. That you matter because you're alive, not because of what you've produced. The ancient farmers of Chenla understood that the land itself was sacred, not because of what it produced, but because of what it was. The source of life, the foundation of everything, worthy of respect and care simply for existing. You are like that land, sacred, not because of your accomplishments, but because of your existence, worthy of care and respect and tenderness simply because you are. Your life has meaning, not because of what you've done, but because you've lived it, because you've been here, because you've been part of the great field of humanity, growing alongside others, contributing to the whole simply by existing and trying and continuing. Rest now in this truth. Let it settle over you like warm covers. Let it surround you like the safety of your bed. Let it hold you like the earth holds seeds through winter, protecting them, keeping them safe, allowing them to rest deeply until spring comes. You're safe here, in this bed, in this moment, in this life you've lived. You're exactly where you need to be. Nothing is required of you right now except rest, except surrender, except allowing yourself to drift into sleep. The fires die down, the stories settle, and the world grows still. Let your thoughts drift away like embers on the wind, like seeds floating on water, finding their own way to wherever they need to be. Good night. You've journeyed far through time tonight, through all the seasons of your life, through childhood and growth and maturity and aging, through planting and tending and harvesting and rest, through all the cycles that make a complete life. Now it's time to journey into dreams. Close your eyes, breathe, and let sleep find you.